Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram @snoozecast to find behind-the-scenes content. If you enjoy our show, please write a review on the Apple Podcasts app. Please know that we read and appreciate every single one. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters and by Riverside Picnics. Tonight, we'll read the next part to our Magic Cloak series from the book Queen Zixi of Ix, or The Story of the Magic Cloak, a children's book written by L. Frank Baum and published in 1905. If you'd like to listen to this continuing story easily in order, go to snoozecast.com/series. In the last episode, Queen Zixi steals the magic cloak from Princess Fluff using deception and cunning. She then finds out that all of her work was for nothing. The cloak does not grant wishes to those that steal it. Zixi grows wiser, though, through her disappointing realization. We are also introduced to a society of quarrelsome creatures called Roly-Rogues that live high on a mountaintop above the cloud line. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. A few days after King Bud's army had defeated the army of Ix, one of the Roly-Rogues, while fighting with another, rolled too near the edge of the plain whereon they dwelt, and bounded down the mountainside that faced Noland. Wind had scattered the clouds, so his fellows immediately rolled themselves to the edge and watched the luckless Roly-Rogue fly down the mountain, bounce across the plain, and then speed down the next mountain. By and by, he became a dot to their eyes, and then a mere speck. But as the clouds had just rolled away for a few moments, the Roly-Rogues could see, by straining their eyes, the city of Knoll lying in the valley far below. It seemed from that distance merely a toy city, but they knew it must be a big place to show so far away. And since they had no cities of their own, they became curious to visit the one they had just discovered. The ruler of the Roly-Rogues, who was more quarrelsome than any of the rest, had a talk with his chief men about visiting the unknown city. "We can just roll down the mountain just as our brother did," he argued. "But how in the world could we ever get back again?" said one of the chiefs, sticking his head up to look with astonishment at the ruler. "We don't want to get back," said the other, excitedly. "Someone has built many houses and palaces at the foot of the mountains, and we can live in those, if they are big enough, and there are enough of them." "Perhaps the people won't let us," suggested another chief, who was not in favor of the expedition. "We will fight and destroy them," retorted the ruler, scowling at the chief as if he would make him ashamed of his cowardice. "Then we must all go together," said a third chief, "for, if only a few go, we may find ourselves many times outnumbered and at last be overcome." "Every Roly-Rogue in the country shall go," declared the ruler, who brooked no opposition when once he had made up his mind to a thing. On the plain grew a grove of big thorn trees, bearing thorns as long and sharp as swords. So the ruler commanded each of his people to cut 2 of the thorns, 1 for each hand, with which to attack whatever foes they might meet when they reach the unknown valley. Then, on a certain day, all the hundreds and thousands of Roly-Rogues that were in existence assembled upon the edge of their plain, and, at the word of their ruler, hurled themselves down the mountain with terrible cries and went bounding away toward the peaceful city of Nole. Chapter 17. The Descent of the Roly-Rogues. King Bud and Princess Fluff were leading very happy and peaceful lives in their beautiful palace. All wars and dangers seemed at an end, and there was nothing to disturb their content. All the gold that was needed, the royal purse-bearer was able to supply from his overflowing purse. The gigantic General Tollydob became famous throughout the world, and no nation dared attack the army of Noland. The talking dog of old Tallydab made everyone wonder, and people came many miles to see Ruffles and hear him speak. It was said that all this good fortune had been brought to Noland by the pretty Princess Fluff, who was a favorite of the fairies, and the people loved her on this account, as well as for her bright and sunny disposition. King Bud caused his subjects some little anxiety, to be sure, for they never could tell what he was liable to do next, except that he was sure to do something unexpected. But much is forgiven a king, and if Bud made some pompous old nobleman stand on his head to amuse a mob of people, he would give him a good dinner afterward and fill his purse with gold to make up for the indignity. Fluff often reproved her brother for such pranks, but Bud's soul was flooded with mischief, and it was hard for him to resist letting a little of the surplus escape now and then. After all, the people were fairly content and prosperous, and no one was at all prepared for the disasters soon to overtake them. One day, while King Bud was playing at ball with some of his courtiers on a field outside the city gates, the first warning of trouble reached him. Bud had batted a ball high into the air, and while looking upward for it to descend, he saw another ball bound from the plain at the top of the North Mountains, fly into the air, and then sink gradually toward him. As it approached, It grew bigger and bigger until it assumed mammoth proportions. And then, while the courtiers screamed, the great ball struck the field near them, bounced high into the air, and came down directly upon the sharp point of one of the palace towers, where it stuck fast with a yell that sounded almost human. For some moments, Bud and his companions were motionless through surprise. Then they rushed into the city and stood among the crowd of people which had congregated at the foot of the tower to stare at the big ball impaled upon its point. Once in a while, 2 arms, 2 short legs, and a head would dart out from the ball and wiggle frantically, and then the yell would be repeated, and the head and limbs withdrawn swiftly into the ball. It was all so curious that the people were justified in staring at it in amazement, for certainly no one had ever seen or heard of a Roly-Rogue before, or even known such a creature existed. Finally, as no one else could reach the steeple top, Aunt Rivette flew into the air and circled slowly around the ball. When next its head was thrust out, she called, "Are you a mud turtle or a man?" "I'll show you which, if I get a hold of you," answered the Roly-Rogue fiercely. "Where did you come from?" asked Aunt Rivette, taking care the wiggling arms did not grab her. "That is none of your business," said the Roly-Rogue. "But I didn't intend to come, that you may depend on." "Are you hurt?" she inquired, seeing that the struggles of the creature made him spin around upon the steeple point like a windmill. "No, I'm not hurt at all," declared the Roly-Rogue, "but I'd like to know how to get down." "What would you do if we helped you get free?" asked Aunt Rivette. "I'd fight every one of those idiots who are laughing at me down there," said the creature, its eyes flashing wickedly. "Then you'd best stay where you are," returned old Rivette, who flew back to earth again to tell Bud what the Roly-Rogue had said. "I believe that is the best place for him," said Bud, "so we'll let him stay where he is. He's not very ornamental, I must say, but he's very safe up there on top of the steeple." "We might have him gilded," proposed the old woman, "and then he'd look better." "I'll think it over," said the king, and he went away to finish his ball game. The people talked and wondered about the strange creature on the steeple, but no one could say where it came from or what it was. They were naturally much puzzled. The next day was bright with sunshine. So, early in the forenoon, Bud and Fluff had the royal cook fill their baskets with good things to eat and set out to picnic on the bank of the river that separated Noland from the kingdom of Ix. They rode ponies to reach the river sooner than by walking, and their only companions were Tallydab, the Lord High Steward, and his talking dog, Ruffles. It was after this picnic party had passed over the mountain and were securely hidden from anyone in the city of Knoll that the ruler of the Roly-Rogues and his thousands of followers hurled themselves down from their land above the clouds and began bounding toward the plain below. The people first heard a roar that sounded like distant thunder, and when they looked toward the North Mountains, they saw the air black with tiny bouncing balls that seemed to drop from the drifting clouds which always had obscured the highest peak. But although appearing small when first seen, these balls grew rapidly larger as they came nearer, and then, with sharp reports like shots in the air, they began dropping upon the plain by dozens and hundreds and then thousands. As soon as they touched the ground, they bounded upward again, like rubber balls the children throw upon the floor. But each bound was less violent than the one preceding it, until finally, within the streets of the city and upon all the fields surrounding it, lay the thousands of Roly-Rogues that had fallen from the mountain peak. At first, they lay still, as if stunned by their swift journey and collision with the hard earth. But after a few seconds, they recovered, thrust out their heads and limbs, and scrambled upon their flat feet. Then the Roly-Rogues uttered hoarse shouts of joy, for they were safely arrived at the city they had seen from afar, and the audacious adventure was a success. Chapter 18: The Conquest of Noland. It would be impossible to describe the amazement of the people of Knoll when the Roly-Rogues came upon them. Not only was the descent wholly unexpected, but the appearance of the invaders was strange enough to strike concern to the stoutest heart. Their round bodies were supported by short, strong legs, having broad, flattened feet to keep them steady. Their arms were short, and the fingers of their hands, while not long, were very powerful. But the heads were the most startling portions of these strange creatures. They were flat and thick on the top, with leathery rolls around the necks, so that, when the head was drawn in, its upper part rounded out the surface of the ball. In this particular head, the Roly-Rogue had two big eyes as shiny as porcelain, a small stubby nose, and a huge mouth. Their strange, leather-like clothing fitted their bodies closely and was of different colors: green, yellow, red, and brown. Taken all together, the Roly-Rogues were not pretty to look at, and although their big eyes gave them a startled or astonished expression. Nothing seemed ever to startle or astonish them in the least. When they arrived in the valley of Knoll, after their wonderful journey down the mountains, they scrambled to their feet, extended their long arms with the thorns clasped tight in their talon-like fingers, and rushed in a furious crowd and with loud cries upon the people. The soldiers of Tollydom's brave army had not even time to seize their weapons, for such a foe, coming upon them through the air, had never been dreamed of. And the men of Knoll, who might have resisted the enemy, were too much frightened to do more than tremble and gasp with open mouths. As for the women and children, they fled into their houses and bolted or locked the doors, which was doubtless the wisest thing they could have done. General Tollydob was asleep when the calamity of this invasion occurred, but hearing the shouts, he ran out of his mansion and met several of the Roly-Rogues face to face. Without hesitation, the brave general rushed upon them, but two of the creatures promptly rolled themselves against him from opposite directions, so that the 10-foot giant was squished between them until he could hardly breathe. No sooner did these release him than two other Roly-Rogues rolled toward him, but Tollydob was not to be caught twice, so he gave a mighty jump and jumped right over their heads, with the result that the balls crashed against each other. This made the two Roly-Rogues so angry that they began to fight each other, and the general started to run away. But other foes rolled after him, knocked him down, and poked their thorns into him until he yelled for mercy and promised to become their slave. Tollydob, the chief counselor, watched all this from his window, and it frightened him so greatly that he crawled under his bed and hid, hoping the creatures would not find him. But their big, round eyes were sharp at discovering things, so the Roly-Rogues had not been in Tullydub's room 2 minutes before he was dragged from beneath his bed and prodded with thorns until he promised obedience to the conquerors. The Lord High Purse-bearer, at the first alarm, dug a hole in the garden of the royal palace and buried his purse so no one could find it but himself. But he might have saved himself this trouble, for the Roly-Rogues knew nothing of money or its uses, being accustomed to seizing whatever they desired without a thought of rendering payment for it. Having buried his purse, old Tillydib gave himself up to the invaders as their prisoner, and this saved him the indignity of being conquered. The Lord High Executioner may really be credited with making the only serious fight of the day, for when the Roly-Rogues came upon him, Tellydeb clenched his fist, and, before the enemy could come near, he reached out his long arm and cleverly boxed the ears from several of their round bodies. The others paused for a moment, being unused to such warfare and not understanding how an arm could reach so far. But seeing that they were in danger from this long arm, about 100 of the creatures formed themselves into balls and rolled upon the executioner in a straight line, hoping to crush him. They could not see what happened after they began to roll, their heads being withdrawn. But Tellydeb watched them speed toward him and, stepping aside, he aimed a strong blow with his fist at the body of the first Roly-Rogue that passed him. Instead of harming the rubber-like body, the fist bounced back and flew into the air, falling farther away with his long arm than the executioner could reach. Therefore, he was helpless and was wise enough to surrender without further resistance. Finding no one else to resist them, the Roly-Rogues contented themselves with bounding against the people that were outside of their houses, great and humble alike, and knocking them over, laughing boisterously at the figures sprawling in the mud of the streets. And then they would poke the bodies of the men with their sharp thorns, making them spring to their feet again, only to be bowled over again the next minute. But the monsters soon grew weary of this amusement, for they were anxious to explore the city they had so successfully invaded. They flocked into the palace and public buildings and gazed eagerly at the many beautiful and, to them, novel things that were found. The mirrors delighted them, and they fought one another for the privilege of standing before the glasses to admire the reflection of their strange round bodies. They could not sit in the chairs, for the round bodies would not fit them. Neither could the Roly-Rogues understand the use of beds, for when they rested or slept, the creatures merely withdrew their limbs and heads, rolled over upon their backs, and slept soundly, no matter where they might be. The shops were all entered and looted of their wares, the Roly-Rogues wantonly destroying all that they could not use. They were like ostriches in eating anything that looked attractive to them. One of the monsters swallowed several pretty glass beads, and some of the more inquisitive of them invaded the grocery shops and satisfied their curiosity by tasting of nearly everything in sight. It was funny to see their wry faces when they sampled the salt and vinegar. the entire city was under the dominion of the Roly-Rogues, who forced the people to wait upon them and amuse them, and if any hesitated to obey their commands, the Roly-Rogues would bump against them and pull their hair hard. Aunt Rivette was in her room at the top of the palace when the Roly-Rogues invaded the city of Knoll. At first, she was frightened like the others, but she soon remembered she could escape by flying. So she quietly watched them from the windows. By and by, as they explored the palace, they came to Aunt Rivette's room. There she soared calmly through the air, and having remembered that Bud and Fluff had gone to the river on a picnic, she flew swiftly in that direction, and before long came to where they were having their picnic, while the dog Ruffles, who was in good spirits, sang a song to amuse them.